is Afshin Marashi, and I'm the director of the Farzaneh Family Center for Iranian and Persian Gulf Studies here at the University of Oklahoma. And on behalf of everyone here at the center and at the university, I'd like to welcome you to the OU Iranian Studies podcast. We are recording this podcast in early November of 2019, and this is another in our ongoing series of podcast interviews with visiting speakers that we invite here to the OU Farzaneh Center for Iranian Studies. Actually, if you haven't had a chance to listen to our other podcast episodes, please go to the Farzaneh Center website and you can listen to them there. I think we have about half a dozen or so podcasts recorded now, so you can listen to those there. We also have a video library of talks given by our visiting speakers, which you can also watch on our YouTube channel, also on the website. And please like us on Facebook to stay updated on things. Anyway, for today's episode, we are very fortunate to have with us Professor Eric Loeb. Eric is an assistant professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at Florida International University in Miami. So, Eric, welcome to the OU Iranian Studies podcast.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you, Eric. Eric's research focuses on issues of politics and economic development in the Middle East, with a focus on Iran, although, as we'll see, he discusses, or his research goes beyond Iran as well. But it's fair to say he has an Iran focus in much of his work. Eric completed his PhD in Near Eastern Studies at Princeton in 2013, and he also has degrees from University of Pennsylvania and the Johns Hopkins University. And I should add, your dissertation won the Best Dissertation Award, and was it 2013? Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
From the Foundation for Iranian Studies?
That's right,
Well,
yes.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
And we are happy to report his revised manuscript will be published in just a few months by Cambridge University Press.
That's right,
And
yes.
so when is it actually coming out?
Well, on the website it says December 2019.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
So that's next month?
Yes, next month.
So you've gone through the proofs and everything?
Yes, I went through the proofs in late September. The book's been in production since the summer. So hopefully we'll see it in print and at the end of 2019, if not early 2020.
And so what's the title of the book?
The title is Iran's Reconstruction Jihad, Rural Development and Regime Consolidation After 1979.
Oh, fantastic. All right. So, yeah, definitely a Iran since 79 focus.
Yes.
Well, we're all very eager to see it in print, and I'm eager to hear more about the book, and we can discuss that as well. But before we get into a discussion of the book, maybe you can just tell us something broadly about your academic background and how you came to select your particular research specialization.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, I've been interested in the Middle East and the Arab world at the master's level, and then when I entered my PhD program, I had come in with a knowledge of Arabic, having studied Arabic in Syria. Mm-hmm. Our program at Princeton, our PhD program, the Near Eastern Studies department, it required actually its students to learn a second Middle East language, so I chose Persian, given the geostrategic and geopolitical relations that exist between Syria and Iran, and was fortunate enough to go to Iran to study Persian and at the Dekhoda Institute in Tehran.
Oh, that's fantastic.
And then being on the ground really, I really started gravitating towards studying Iranian politics, history, and society and culture.
And you were there from when to when?
I was there from 2009 to 2011, on and off.
So I'll definitely want to ask you more about that, your time there. But in terms of situating yourself, in terms of discipline, I mean, you say you're a graduate from the Near Eastern Studies PhD program at Princeton, but your book also has a kind of political science dimension to it, and I'm just wondering how you kind of position yourself as a political scientist or as a area studies specialist. I mean, I'll tell you, as a historian, I found your manuscript very accessible.
Okay, thank you.
Even though I'm not a political scientist. And I'm just trying to figure out what it is about your work that actually makes it accessible beyond the kind of immediate discipline, if that's political science. Is that something you think about?
Oh, absolutely. In terms of how to navigate our disciplinary boundaries in academia, both in the United States and even beyond. And as you said, I do have an area studies PhD. At Princeton, they encourage the students in the Department of Near Eastern Studies to latch on to another discipline. So I chose political science. I have colleagues who chose history and religion. And in terms of situating my work and my research, I would say that I do plug into political science theories on revolution, on social movement, on social activism, but also touch on both theoretically but even methodologically on a historical, sociological approach. So I think the book does border on different disciplines. You could call it an interdisciplinary work, and largely uses qualitative methods.
Yeah, so it's a qualitative method. I mean, I think a lot of the political science work that we see now has a more of a quantitative method. It's
Right.
almost as though political science is kind of evolved into the economics department, and there's nothing wrong with that, and there's a lot that can be maybe gained from that. But there's probably much less of that quantitative approach in your work.
And you see it, I think, in Middle East political science. I mean, I have seen works that use a more positivist approach. I think some of the better works I've seen use mixed methods, both quantitative and qualitative. You could use quantitative methods and regression models to show general patterns, but it's also a good idea, I think, to delve deeper into specific cases qualitatively as well. So, and also it speaks to, I think, the methodological limitations of the Middle East in terms of accessing quality and reliable and transparent quantitative data that makes it difficult and may make you have to rely more on qualitative approaches.
I see. Yeah, I mean, that's part of the challenge of doing the research in that region is
Right.
it lends itself maybe more to that kind of field work and qualitative approach. I mean, and that goes maybe to the strongest part of your methodological approach, which is sort of the deep immersion in the language and in the society.
Right.
So you have advanced level Persian and Arabic, so that's basically methodologically speaking, that's kind of maybe the thing that stands out most is the time you spent there. And
Right.
So is it based mostly on interviews and that kind of work, or what other kind of mixed methods then characterizes the book?
So at the base of the work, at the core, I would say, is, like you said, interviews, ethnography, even participant observation, a term anthropologists and use and sociologists. But to triangulate those interviews, I also actually accessed archives and libraries in Iran to make sure that what I was hearing from my informants and my interviewees matched up to what I was seeing in books, articles, documents, reports, etc. So really to try to get a holistic group of sources to corroborate what I was hearing from the interviewees.
And I guess that's the interdisciplinary element. I guess that's what makes it accessible to me is the archival element,
Right.
The textual element, and then combining that with the ethnographic and qualitative approach that you make. And I think that probably describes the book, your approach at least, pretty well. And I definitely endorse the book on those grounds as well. As a historian, as I say, it's very accessible to someone like me, and I learned a great deal about Iran since '79. By reading the book. So let's talk about the book. Can you maybe give us an overview of the book? What's the book about? What's the central argument?
The central argument and question is how, since '79 and even in '79, when the government, the state, the regime, however you want to label it, was trying to consolidate power, how did it use development to how did it instrumentalize development to consolidate power domestically in 1979 and through the early 1980s, because it wasn't a given that Khomeini and the Islamic Republican Party and the circle of clerics and lay leaders around him would consolidate power. They were facing opponents that were originally part of the revolutionary coalition against the Shah that then fragmented, as we often see in revolutionary and post-revolutionary states. And then also, how did the Islamic Republic use development to project its influence to other parts of the Muslim and developing world in places like Lebanon and Africa, which the book covers? are really the main questions that the book tackles through the case study of its rural and development organization, Jihad-e Sazendegi, or that translates to Reconstruction or Construction Jihad, which was established in the early months after the transition, officially established in June of 1979, but even started in February when Khomeini makes his way back to Iran and the Shah leaves. And it really shows you that this was a priority for the government, for the provisional government, because the first thing that they do is they establish the Revolutionary Guard as a parallel institution to the military. But then right after that, just several months later, they establish Jihad-e Sazendegi as a parallel institution
This
to
is
the.
when, in 79?
So the organization begins actually, and this gets into one of the things I look at in terms of how this organization is mobilized. So it actually starts mobilizing from the bottom up in February of 1979. Before it's officially established as a revolutionary organization in June of 1979.
Okay. So we're still talking the transitional government.
Right, provisional government.
Right.
And, the Khomeini and Bazargan had different visions of the organization, and this kind of gets into early factionalism that we see from the moment the provisional government is established.
So when you talk about the development, you are really talking about the rural dimension.
Right.
So it's sort of the rural policy was, as you're suggesting, central to the revolutionary project right from the very beginning.
Right.
And so how would you maybe talk about the earlier scholarship on the rural dimension in Iranian studies, for example? I mean, I remember when I was an undergraduate in the 80s, the one book that I knew about, and I don't think there was a lot more than this, was the Eric Hoagland book, Land and Revolution, which is basically about the land reform. And maybe there's the Mary Hegland, I think, did some ethnography. I guess Ann Lambton did some stuff on land, too, even earlier. But, there hasn't been anything since, as far as I know.
In the United States.
So, I mean, what your book is really doing is picking up on that thread of work that was very important in, the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I think the Eric Hoagland book came out in 1980. I'm not sure.
Yeah, 1980s.
So, how do you kind of connect with that scholarship? Maybe we can talk about that.
Sure. Well, like you said, Eric Hoagland looks at primarily at the Shah's land reform and also rural development and agricultural policies during the White Revolution, and he had been on the ground there, so he had the luxury of seeing these events unfold and the unintended consequences of those policies. How the Shah was trying to win rural and provincial support, but ended up with unintended consequences and deficiencies of these policies, actually politicizing, radicalizing segments of the population. And he was countering the narrative that the peasants or the villagers were apolitical and passive during the revolution, and showing no, as a matter of fact, they were at least segments of them, and there's also some generational differences, but were very much mobilized, politicized, radicalized leading up to it. Given the changes that were going on structurally, but also with the oil boom of the 60s and 70s, but also the policies that were being enacted under the Shah.
Because it turns out land reform was a very difficult thing to actually carry out.
Right.
So it had a lot of unintended consequences.
Exactly.
Whether incompetence or just the sheer challenge of it.
Right.
It had unintended consequences. But, you mentioned this. I mean, Eric was on the ground.
Right.
And he sort of was able to see this. And what made that kind of scholarship, I think Ann Lambton and Mary Hegland as well, was they were able to do field work and sort of see this rural dimension as it was taking shape.
Right.
And you've done that.
Right.
And that's kind of one of the things that really jumps out in your work is that you actually did manage to do field work in the rural dimension and figure that out. How did you manage to do this? This is one of the things we always complain about in Iranian studies, is how difficult it is to actually do real field work in Iran. I mean, I guess that's maybe the burning question is how did you do this? Can I ask you? How did you do it?
I would. Well,
is it a secret you don't want to tell?
No, I mean, if it could help other researchers go to Iran and do quality research, because as you said, there's a big lacuna in that area that needs to be filled. So, I mean, really, it was a combination. I mean, I can get into the methodological technicalities. and approaches. But really, I mean, what it boiled down to was a combination of luck and persistence. I mean, I was traveling on a French passport, so I was able to access Iran, go to Dekhoda, and then start making contacts with former members of Jihad-e Zendegi, many of them in the Ministry of Agriculture. I had, actually, thanks to Dr. Huglin, who put me in touch with some people, I had some academics in Iran who were also helping me with this project and putting me in touch with individuals they knew, that either rural experts that could shed light on this subject, or people they knew that were once affiliated with Jihad-e Zendegi. So I had, support academically, and as well as, making more and more contacts, and really just continuing to follow up with people. Some people were hesitant, understandably, to speak with me initially, and said, "Look, why don't you call me back a day later or a week later?" And I would make sure, I'd make a note in the calendar and always follow up with people until they either said no, or they finally agreed to meet with me. And over time, what we refer to as snowball sampling, I developed a network of contacts, both academically but also in the ministries, in the bureaucracies, and even outside of it, in companies and organizations where there were former members. There were thousands of people in this organization, so it's quite an expansive network. But tapping into it as much as I could, getting outside of Tehran to the extent that I could, because, like you said, it was an organization that operated mainly in provinces and villages. So getting there and making contacts outside, and getting the perspective outside of the capital, which is very important, to the fullest extent possible.
And so, so you were able to actually do this. You didn't have any run-ins or any kind of sketchy moments when you were doing. Some of this stuff is a little bit sensitive, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the thing is too, is I came into it saying, look, I'm doing a project on development, that framing it as a relatively innocuous topic, but as you said, any subject you start delving into has a political dimension to it. So there were sensitivities, and I did run into some issues at the very end of my stay. Things were going relatively smoothly, and I was checking in with people from time to time that were affiliated with the Iranian government and being very transparent with them about my work. But at the end, like the United States, there's multiple security agencies, and I guess one of a security agency that didn't like what I was doing came in the middle of one of my interviews in one of the ministries, and detained me for several hours, and it was fortunate that I was able to escape detention, or not escape, but to get out of it. Again, given that by that point I had a network that could vouch for me and say, he's doing serious research, his intentions are noble or professional or serious, and vouching for me and allowing me to get out of detention. At that and at that point I had collected a lot of data, because it was really at the end of my stint in Iran, and it's what ended it, essentially, because the professors that I was speaking with told me, it's time to leave now. Take the data you've collected a a lot of data, and go back to the United States. And coming back to the United States was not a foregone conclusion either. Right. With U.S. customs officials, so obviously navigating all of that becomes very tricky.
Well, the result is really interesting and fascinating and well documented, very rich book. So maybe we can talk a little bit about the book then. When you talk about one of the themes that comes up is this idea of soft power and the durability of the Islamic Republic, and the sort of use of non-coercive measures for sort of consolidating. Is that sort of what grew out of all this research, is sort of piecing that together?
Yes, absolutely. My first time there was in 2009 during the Green Movement, and one thing that I was, as a distant observer, intentionally from the demonstrations and the protests, one thing I noticed is that in contrast to the Arab Spring, and again, I know that there was a lot of arrests, and I'm not discounting coercion by any means. I know that the government did use coercion during that time to maintain power. But you see a fairly low number compared to the Arab Spring of casualties during that time. And the obviously there's contrast between what state officials were saying versus what activists, but even we're talking about dozens of lives that were lost during that period. So it really raised this question of what else is the state doing to persevere. And when you look at the literature on Iran, on revolutionary Iran, even pre-revolutionary Iran, a lot of the focus is on these coercive institutions. So very little work had been done on Jihadist al-Zendigi. And as I said, again, it was really a priority for the government because at the time of the revolution in 1979, over half the population was still living in villages. And a lot had been done in the villages. So the state wanted to live up to the promise of that the Shah had started with the White Revolution of delivering goods and services and improving livelihoods there. And at the same time, there was obviously a political dimension to this project to win hearts and minds, to marginalize opponents, and to really increase and expand a state presence in the rural areas. So it shows the non-coercive side, the soft power. Of course, when things got contentious in some provinces, particularly the ethnic provinces along the borders, the IRGC would go in, the army and the security forces would go in, and that was the hard power of the state. But alongside them, or even ahead of them, was this soft power arm of this development organization, delivering goods and services to the people. And so, for example, one of the representatives of Jihadist al-Zendigi in his memoirs states very upfront that this was, the political mission that we wanted to, use. He doesn't use the term soft power that, Nye had brought to the social sciences, but he basically says we want to go in there, we want to gain popular legitimacy and support in these areas. We want to marginalize opponents, radical leftist opponents, Mujahideen al-Khalq, the Fedayeen, and others that had also been establishing a presence in the villages and delivering goods and services. And so they were worried that the revolution, as informants or interviews had said, would be hijacked by these groups. And they wanted to outdo them and really bring the rural population to their side.
Yeah, I mean, and that's one of the things that comes across in the book is the sort of the evolution of this rural dimension from certain different stages in how this policy, this state-led non-coercive policy evolves. And can you kind of divide that out, sort of different periods? I mean, there's the early period of the revolution, and then something it definitely evolves after that into a different stage. What are these different stages?
Yeah, so again, 1979 to about 1982, 1983 is really this phase of consolidation where, I mean, Khomeini and the Islamic Republican Party, they're concerned. I mean, they bring Bazargan and the freedom movement into the fold. Both sides are concerned about, radical leftist groups that I had mentioned, Marxist groups, Islamist Marxist groups. So they're using jihad as a soft power instrument to kind of marginalize them. And jihadi activists, even though some of them are leftists, are also concerned about these groups in the villages. So, they're working together. Eventually, we know that Bazargan is marginalized. But, this is a main argument of the book that between 1979, 1982, 1983, jihad was instrumental, really, in helping the regime consolidate power in the provinces, in the villages, alongside the IRGC and other institutions. There were other soft power institutions, too. The Imam Khomeini Relief Committee, the Housing Foundation, in terms of, trying to win the population over, marginalize opponents. And you see a consolidation in 1982, 1983, where these groups are severely marginalized or weakened. Of course, there's also initiatives being taken by the government to marginalize these opponents in the cities as well. So there's an urban side of the story, but I really focus more on the rural. And so by 1982, 1983, the regime, the state, the government is more comfortable thanks to this amalgamation of parallel institutions that have been active in the villages, both in trying to help the rural population and outdo these radical leftist groups. And then after that, not coincidentally, the organization is transformed into a ministry and brought into the bureaucratic fold. And
that's about 83 then?
That's 83, exactly. 1983 to 2001, it really becomes part of the Iranian bureaucracy. And that leads to all sorts. It was done for a variety of reasons. One of the interesting things is that all the different factions in the Islamic Republican Party, the leftists, the rightists, the centrists, they all agree actually to bring it into the bureaucratic fold. So, this is an example that I don't think is highlighted enough in the literature on Iran, that actually these factions at times can agree on things and come to a consensus. They're not always competing and at each other's throats. So this is one example of when there's, for various reasons, they agree to institutionalize the organization and bureaucratize it, which creates a dynamic where, because the organization was initially anti-bureaucratic, and so the activists who were in the organization believed that they were actually doing what the bureaucracy wasn't. That up until the time of the revolution, the bureaucrats who were affiliated with the Shah were sitting in Tehran. They were drinking tea, collecting their paychecks, caring more about their careers in the actual rural areas. So these revolutionary activists that were part of jihad thought they were doing the right thing, right. And really filling the void that the bureaucracy was not filling. Or not doing. And then they became part of the bureaucracy. So some of them wanted that. Some of them wanted, career stability and paychecks, just like the bureaucrats, although some of them are reluctant to admit that.
I think you say some of them left the bureaucracy out of sort of
frustration. Or they were stuck in the bureaucracy. So even today when you talk to some of them, there's this frustration that now they're just like the bureaucrats that they were railing against when they started the organization. Individualism, careerism, red tape, stagnancy, all these things that come, even though, theorists like Max Weber praise the merits of bureaucracy. I think this case also shows the shortcomings of bureaucracy that are not just unique to Iran, but exist in a lot of contexts outside of Iran.
So there's this revolutionary stage, then there's this sort of bureaucratization stage, and then you also talk about this idea of associationalism. Is that a later stage yet? Is that comes next, or what comes after that?
Yes. So the associations really started in the 2000s, and particularly as I would say as the reformists come on the scene, and there becomes this intense factionalism inside the government, but also, of course, it spills over into society, where this intense competition between reformists and conservatives. And you see jihadists who are, or former members of Jihadist al-Zindagi, establishing these associations. And this brings into questions about civil society in Iran and in a post-revolutionary state, in terms of how autonomous these associations really are. And these associations, they represent different factions. Some are more sympathetic towards the conservatives, some are more sympathetic towards the reformists, or even within them, they're not monolithic. There's different strains within them. And they present themselves on the surface as autonomous, but when you start to dig deeper, you see that they're actually being supported or encouraged by political elites. So there's a blurry area there. And there's a scholar that uses, or certain scholars of civil society and social movements in the Middle East have used the expression gongo. It's kind of an oxymoron or a paradox, government-organized, non-governmental organizations.
It's like corporatism.
Corporatism or co-optation, exactly. And so on the one hand, you see a corporatist element to these associations or dimension. On the other hand, you actually see unintended consequences that they create these associations, and then their closeness with elites empower them to start making demands on these elites, right? So all of a sudden, these elites are feeling uncomfortable. They're feeling pressured by these groups. So one example is that because Jihadist al-Zindagi played an important role in the war by supporting troops, its engineers provided logistical support, it created a veterans association that then demanded more from even the conservatives and hardliners that come into power in the 2000s, Ahmadinejad and others, to give more compensation and more services to war veterans.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So it has a kind of an effort to kind of create a kind of mobilizing project to kind of help to establish more of a loyalty to these groups, but then they kind of take on a life of their own.
Right,
And
exactly.
in a sense, that sounds like Iranian politics.
Exactly, exactly. And even from the beginning, the organization mobilizes from below these activists, and then they actually start pushing Khomeini and the IRP and even Bazargan and the freedom movement to support them. So, from the very beginning, there's these bottom-up, top-down dynamics that are very interesting, and looking at the mobilization over time that, again, often gets neglected in the literature and the scholarship. That often makes it a top-down process. The state is doing all the
Absolutely.
mobilizing.
And you can only figure out the bottom up process if you're there talking to people,
Right.
which is what you've done here.
Right, right.
In the revolutionary stage that you talked about, I don't want to pass up on this idea of the role of the left, which I think you talk about this in the book and you mentioned it, is in some ways the Jihad-e-Sazandagi was an effort to kind of compete with or catch up with the role of the revolutionary leftist organizations.
Right.
And, if you look at the the broad coalition of that period from the 70s into the revolution, there's a kind of the Maoist element
Right.
was actually a big part of that movement.
Right.
And they understood the rural dimension probably better than many of the the Khomeiniist factions. And part of the story that you tell is how the left basically was marginalized in this process. But there's that story, in some ways, the history of the Iranian left is a story that's in some ways been written out of the history of Iran since '79. And you have a lot to say about that then. So how exactly did that play out in that revolutionary stage, the role of the secular left, let's call it?
Right. No, absolutely. It's a complicated subject that I dedicate a lot of time or space in the book to. As I said, Khomeini was actually concerned about these groups staging a Maoist revolution. And they actually, so the former members of Jihad that I interviewed, they admitted to going out to the provinces and villages and seeing what Mujahideen al-Khalq and Fadayan and other secular but also Islamist Marxist groups were doing. And then kind of appropriating their strategy and tactics, and then pushing them to the side. And what's interesting is that members of Jihad, some of them were right-wing and more interested in faith-based development, but others very much leftist and very much appropriating the agenda of these groups, and so really championing land reform and nationalization of industry and redistribution of wealth. And were very disillusioned, actually. So, they had similar agendas. And as a matter of fact, to escape persecution, one interesting thing I found out is some members of these opposition groups actually, to escape persecution, joined Jihad. They joined forces with them.
Right, they got absorbed into it.
Yeah, and some were purged. They weren't as lucky. Right. They ended up in prison and executed. But some were able to get their way into Jihad and stay there. And become part of it. And as a whole, so, the leftist strain of the organization continues. And, even with the marginalization of these groups and their demise.
Well, I think that's a really important point because I think there is a kind of reassessment and a return to trying to write the history of the Iranian left into the history of modern Iran.
Right.
And one of the things I want to make sure everyone sort of recognizes is that your book is actually contributing to that evolving historiography as well. So
Thanks.
that's, I think, going to be another way of making your book contribute to other debates that are related to not necessarily to the rural dimension, but to the larger history of the left as well.
Thanks.
One maybe final point to kind of talk about is, your book is not only about Iran, in fact.
Right.
It's about sort of Iran's foreign policy outside of Iran.
Right.
And maybe you can say something about that. How has sort of rural development policy been instrumentalized not only in Iran's rural dimension, but as part of Iran's foreign policy?
Right. So this is something I dedicate 2 chapters in the book to, 1 chapter on Lebanon, 1 in Africa. And we talked earlier about the power consolidation phase between 1979 and the early 1980s. Once the state becomes more comfortable and this organization is converted into a ministry, it begins embarking on overseas missions to export this development model elsewhere. And it targets Lebanon in the 1980s, where it works with Hezbollah on developing this organization there to service and socialize Hezbollah's constituents. And that's an obvious choice and obviously a close and enduring relationship that exists. But the other interesting side to this story is that they deploy to Africa. And largely in non-Muslim or Sunni Muslim territories. So, they're facing kind of demographic challenges and constraints and also foreign competition, but they're able to actually fill a void in that there's, Africa struggles with, or certain countries with, rural development and, have these large agrarian economies and high rates of rural poverty. So the organization really fills a void there in Africa and delivers valuable services. And through that, again, we talk about soft power. Iran is able to project influence in Africa.
Has it been successful? I mean...
It's been successful, but when you look at the literature on Iran and Africa, there tends to be the use of terms like hegemonic and expansionist. And so there were definitely successes, but there's also, as I mentioned, constraints that often are overlooked. And I think show a more nuanced narrative that Iran is not taking over Africa. Right. Kind of dialing down the alarmists.
Yeah, that definitely comes out. I think in your IJMIS, you have an IJMIS article on this too.
Right, on which the chapter is based of the book, And, because, like I said, Iran faces demographic constraints and also geopolitical constraints because, you could look at Iran in isolation in Africa, which I try not to do because there's a whole host of other actors there. I mean, obviously, there's the major powers in the international system, the United States, China, Europe, that brings in a lot of investment to Africa. And even a lot of Middle Eastern countries are in Africa competing there. Arab Gulf states, Israel, Turkey. So, again, that creates strains for Iran, too.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in thinking about and learning a little bit about the book, but we obviously have only still just skimmed along the surface. And maybe we should probably end there, but I think our listeners probably have a good sense of the book, but they should go read it for themselves to see how much more there is in there. And you say it'll be available hopefully in December 2019, just as basically next month from when we're recording. Well, we look forward to seeing it in print. Congratulations on the book. Thanks for making the trip all the way to Oklahoma.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
And thanks for joining us on the OU Iranian Studies podcast. And thanks to our listeners. Until next time, thank you all for joining.